Welcome, my friends and rivals, to another episode of the Money and Breakfast podcast. Our esteemed guest today is Dr. Val Okaru-Bisant, CEO, founder, general counsel, and socioeconomic entrepreneur at Afrocosmo Development Impact. And if I'm not mistaken, I remember this from the first time we met, the first person ever at the World Bank who was an attorney to serve in a non-legal department. So
that's right.
You've got a wide variety of experience. We appreciate you sharing it with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Mike. That's really wonderful. I'm glad I'm here to share some experiences with you in this podcast.
So I want to start with the Afrocosmo and sort of what it does. And I'm very interested in this in particular, the capacity building portion of the business. Now, you partner with local African-based companies to deliver what's called street law. Now, I'm not an attorney. You are of many years. So if you could explain what street law is for our audience. What is the nature of these masterclass training programs, and what are the major topics you're looking to cover, especially when you're looking at local African entrepreneurs on the ground?
Absolutely. That's what's really unique about what we do at Afrocosmo Development Impact. The street law form of capacity building is interactive, it's organic, it's demand-driven. Demand-driven because we always send out a questionnaire before we start the masterclass. And we've had it several times. We've partnered with OZE. It's a company incorporated in Ghana. Yeah. And we've also partnered with Leap Africa, that's incorporated in Nigeria. We train SME, female and youth-owned traders in helping them with access to markets, access to financial and intellectual capital. So it's demand-driven, like I said earlier, because we give them a questionnaire, we ask them questions, normally like 10 questions, based on the responses they give. When we then do the training, we tailor it to their needs and demands. So we respond to the questions that we ask them and the answers that they give. And then it's organic because we expect them to go ahead and implement some of the recommendations that we give them during the training, and we follow up with them a couple of months to a year later to see what they've done with what we used to them. In other words, the training that we gave them. It's a very unique program, and we've been very pleased with it. It's gained a lot of traction within the last couple of years. We've existed for about 6 years, but within the last couple of years, it's gained a lot of traction at the local level. In the training programs that we do, specifically in Africa, are geared to small and medium enterprises, female and youth. And when I say access to intellectual, it's about what their rights and duties are within the framework of AfCFTA, Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and also AGOA, the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. So, yeah.
I'm glad that you brought up AGOA, and I'm also glad you brought up the small and medium enterprises. So that was actually the context with which we first met. I believe it was the Center for Strategic and Emerging Technology. They were having an AGOA conference. We were both there. And a lot of impacts of AGOA, but now that things are getting ready to be renewed, we're sort of discussing what the future of this is going to look like. You were with us after the fact of the need to, tailor these things to make sure that small and medium enterprises are really seeing the good bit about what this capacity is built. Could you tell me a little bit more capacity building side of things and the policy side of things, especially because your organization does so much advocacy, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Sort of how the fusion of it plays itself out in the work that you do.
Yeah, in the work we do on the policy side, we do policy advocacy. In other words, we've written extensively in this area. We were hired by the Revenue Board to write an article concerning FTAs and how FTAs are compliant with AGOA in Africa and also AfCFTA. So we do advocacy targeting audience that are not just here, policy implementers, but also policy implementers in Africa too. So we also do, in terms of what I mentioned earlier, the street law form of capacity building, we help our clients at the grassroots level to understand what their rights and duties are within the framework of AGOA and also AfCFTA. So for instance, like I mentioned that to you when we were talking, we found that there's some challenges that SMEs face. 3 areas specifically: access to markets, access to intellectual and financial. Of the 3, which ones do you think, audience, are the most, I'm sure the SMEs that are listening, you know what the worst case scenario is for an SME in Africa in terms of the challenges that they face. Of the three, which ones do you think? I'm sure you guessed it right. Financial. Okay. So within that framework, we found that the definition of SMEs Africa are not the same within the framework of OECD and most DFIs in developed economies. So what we do within that framework is that we also do advisory besides the training programs that we offer. I mentioned then about the street law. For example, we had a strawberry farmer in northern part of Nigeria sent a grant that was advertised, and I don't want to mention the US company that advertised it, but we tend to do that in terms of providing access to financial. And so when we sent the grant FP to her for her to then apply, she then said, Prof, we don't qualify. And this is not unique to her, but I'm giving her as an example, a company. And the reason was because of definition. And the requirements, the eligibility requirements for SMEs in the grant application was that the SMEs should have, in order to have $350,000 grant and about $300,000 blended finance, in other words, $300,000 loan, the SME in terms of eligibility must have collateral worth about $300,000. And when you look at the how many African countries have, in terms of currency transferability issues, how many African countries have SMEs that actually can afford to, for that? Because when you take into consideration the currency transferability issue and also the devaluation of currency, a millionaire in Africa, say Nigerian Naira, based on the fact that Nigeria has, I think it's now 1,400 Naira to $1, or in Ghana cedis, or like South Africa rand, somebody who is a millionaire or middle class may not qualify in terms of, being a SME that's middle class and able to qualify in the US. So what we did within that context was that we helped her merge with her mother's company. And because I'm also a US, not just only a US attorney, but I'm also a Nigerian attorney. So I qualified to practice within the framework of AfCFTA member nations. So we quickly helped her to merge with her mom's farm. Her mom had a farm in Abuja. And so she was able to, because at that stage, she was worth about, in terms of collateral, about $50,000. So she was able to increase her net worth. But by then, the grant had expired, the time for applying for the grant. However, she was able to qualify in the future for another grant that came up. I think it was with a British organization. So I'm very pleased. She actually wrote a nice testimonial for us. So I'm very pleased with that. So these are the kinds of things we do. There are gaps, of course, when you look at the policy framework that's in place and in terms of implementation of AGOA and what's actually happening on the ground. Yeah. But that's what we seek to do, to close that gap. Yeah.
And I think that that's one thing that's so unique about your organization is, you find a lot of organizations sort of working on either end. They're either working very, very locally on the ground, or they're working almost exclusively with institutions. But in October 2021, you hosted the World Trade Organization Director General after she won the World Trade Organization leadership position. So you're able to still have that influence in the institutional environments. And, you mentioned development finance institutions, DFIs, and sort of the role that they play in this entire ecosystem. Being able to work with the people who are experiencing those gaps at the ground is very, very important. But also being able to go to the, almost the extreme other end, and from the top down, identify these gaps and place them in front of policymakers is very, very. It could play a very, very large role in sort of shifting the conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what you did for her, how you interact in these institutions, and sort of how the whole thing, puts itself together, both the local and then that global institutional side of things?
Yeah. Yes. I want to start by saying that what we did for her, when I invited my partner to join me, he's now a partner with my company, and in terms of being an advisory board member, we did three main things for her. Strategic communication. We also did, helped her with respect to stakeholder engagement and advocacy. So I want to say that she was such a good person to me when I was at the World Bank. So I felt like I owed it to her in 2020 when Buhari appointed her to represent Nigeria and to bid for the WTO DG position. So I said, yes, I jumped on it. I said, we can help. Unfortunately, Frank Samales, who's my partner, jumped in through Squire. So the strategic communication, just helping her communicate effectively, put her in the best position. Like one of the things we mentioned to her was that she's the opportune candidate, because at that time she was with Gavi. She worked with Gavi as, she was an MD. And of course, I really strongly believed that she was the strongest candidate. So I didn't just do it because I was doing her a favor, but I was also returning a favor, knowing that she's been my mentor. She's wonderful. But also, I strongly believe that she was the best opportune candidate, given the exigencies of the time, meaning, it was during COVID, remember 2020. And since she had worked with Gavi, and she was also helping developing countries have access to COVID vaccines, that's trade. Even though her background was in finance, she was also involved in trade, right? Finance, because she was second in command at the World Bank, MD, remember? Yeah. And so it was really perfect timing. They say opportunity met preparedness, so we then, when she won, we were the only company, ACDI and SPV, that she allowed to host her. And of course, it was just around the time 2021, October, COVID was still sort of percolating around, but we all had masks on. So we hosted her in preparation for MC Ministerial Conference 12 Talks, which was on IP waiver. So that was what the subject matter of the fireside chat that we had with her was about. And we were very pleased because she was she did an awesome job, and that's tied in with the advocacy and stakeholder engagement, because we invited high-level policy makers and implementers at Squire to meet with her. It was about 25 of us, so about 30, and also members of the diplomatic corps. It was really good. We're really very excited. She was too. She's very intelligent, very awesome. She's one of my mentors. I admire her, and it was a very successful forum. And soon after, by June, I think June of that year, 2020, the next year, 2022, she was successful because the ministers approved the IP waiver, the decision. So that's awesome. They adopted the IP. That's wonderful.
It is very.
And we also honored her because she was a pioneer, the first female WTO DG. That's wonderful.
It must have been really good to play a part in that.
Oh,
being there's a lot of emphasis on advocacy for women-owned and women-led organizations within your practices, within the work you do, within the people you interact with. So I imagine that was like a major career milestone, a big feather in the cap, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely.
Winning personality. One of the reasons I wanted to have you here is, between just your career, and the roles that you've played with it, whether it's World Bank or in your own or your own endeavors, and partners on your board. There's a large degree of institutional knowledge within your organization. There's a large network. There's a lot of experience. And, there's a very much a firsthand understanding of course, like I said, on the ground of the institutional part of things, to the point where you guys in the work you do, you can sort of pick what your target audience is. You have a lot of options with respect to, okay, we want to advocate in this way with this end goal or endeavor in mind. We want to strategically move towards this objective or push this or that policy, advocate or in this or that way, and on this or that, on this continent or another, frankly. So tell us a little bit, with all this reach, who your target audience often is, and if you wouldn't mind, with some of the, specific initiatives that you've taken on, taking us through the flow of things of who and where and how these things got done. I'm sure it changes with project to project. So if there are a couple of examples that stand out, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. Target audience, I think it depends on what the framework is within which we're operating, because we do like advocacy and we publish. I mentioned earlier the Kenyan the Tax Prison is the magazine, and the audience was the Kenyan government who asked us, through the editorial to publish on FTAs and AfCFTA and challenges, opportunities. So within the framework of the advisory work that we do, because we also do advocacy, we do advisory, we have public-private entities, public entities like what we mentioned, high-level dignitaries, like the scenario I gave with the Ngozi. We also have diplomats, African diplomats within Washington, D.C. that are target audience. And of course, we also have SMEs, female and youth-owned SMEs back in Africa and the diaspora space. You're part of the diaspora space, and I think my audience are part of the diaspora space and friends of the diaspora, because we shouldn't forget the expatriates who like Africa, who are interested in export-import within the framework of AGOA, and also regional trade, trans-border trade in Africa. So our audience, basically, the framework within which we operate is trade, investment, economic development, but then our audience are public-private entities. And like I mentioned earlier, advisory. We also do due diligence, right? Because when we give advice, we don't just give open-ended advice. For instance, I think I discussed the M&A work we did with the farmer, but we also do due diligence. Like if a company wants to merge with another company, we always do some kind of, even for us, there's so many scenarios of due diligence that has saved us, believe it or not, because we have a lot of requests from companies. We do due diligence at various levels. Say a company wants to invest in Africa. We don't just recommend a company in Africa. We have to do due diligence before on that company. If it's a referral or whatever, we also do it when for instance, we had a project on fisheries, cross-border fisheries, where we engaged with the partner on the ground. Unfortunately, with the due diligence, we knew it was a very good company because it's a friend who referred us to the company, and then we partnered with the company on the ground to bid for it. Cross-border, and we won. But anyway, that's just it. I don't want to talk too much because I know you have a lot of questions to ask. So I hope that answered your question. I mean, basically, public-private partners, public-private entities on the ground, and also here. But the framework is within the trade, investment, economic development, but also within trade is cross-border. So if you're interested in investing in Africa, or if an African company is interested in investing here or exporting here, then we look at AGOA, or we look at U.S. Export-Import Bank, kind of. We also hosted President Orama, right, at Milbank, the law firm. We partnered with Milbank, Patrick Campbell, to host him to discuss issues of trade and other pertinent issues, and we invited some investors and high-level corporate leaders at what we call an intimate lunch, and Milbank and Patrick co-hosted it with us. He invited me to join him to do it. Yes.
So, one of the things that, when I was in grad school and I talked with other students, you were just at Georgetown last week. We saw each other there. You were speaking to a crowd of younger people. One of the things we see all the time, or what you see in the space of discourse, is there is a lot of opportunity with respect to especially with respect to African development, to sort of leapfrog certain milestones with good policy, good leadership, and a lot of times the help of the help of or good deployment of emerging technology or technology in general. But then there's also, there's risks there, right? Everybody's concerned, especially in the diaspora space, everybody's concerned about signing a bad deal or, more, tripping and falling into something that is, that is just not beneficial. Again, as I said, in the development space, you have those sort of lost decades come around. What happened in this decade? What happened in that decade? From your experience, what have you seen that are the specific sort of parameters or specific sort of determinants, the checklist pieces that make these public-private investments, successful, beneficial across the board, and especially with respect to any specific sectors that you see? Again, you're the one in the room negotiating the deals, talking directly to the people, who are engaging in this business. What sectors stand out to you in terms of, what might happen around the corner, what might be coming down the pipeline?
In terms of the public-private partnerships, can you repeat the last part of that?
Yeah, so in terms of the public-private partnerships, I mean, for example, when if you talk to a lot of the diaspora here, especially I find if they're 40 and under, 35 and under, if they're looking for entrepreneurship in Africa, you see a lot of people in the healthcare space, you see a lot of people in fintech, sort of agile manufacturing with the help of new technologies. I'm just wondering, is there anything that stands out or that might be on emergence, resurgence in terms of what sectors are doing this the right way?
Which sectors are doing well with respect to PPPs?
Mm-hmm. It's just from what you see.
That's a really interesting question because
it's change this or that aspect of what they're doing.
Yes, it's interesting you raise that because I don't want to digress from your question, but we were instrumental at the World Bank in introducing the community-based participation and the issue of, within the framework of PPPs, social responsibility questions, making them, especially in the water infrastructure sector. This was with Mike Gann, the late Mike Gann, and I think I probably mentioned that to you, that it's actually on my LinkedIn page on the features page. It was a defining moment for me. And my doctoral thesis at Stanford was on this question of, believe it or not, the topic was legal institutional means of controlling water pollution from sewage, looking at 1972 Clean Water Act. But then I dug in further and PPP came up because that was a question of water companies. Should water companies be socially responsible to consumers? But first, I started with the question of, is water a human right? Why are water companies interested in this sector? Because at that time, the late 90s into early 2000, but specifically in the mid 90s, they started getting involved because of scarcity, water scarcity issues. South Africa, of course, the only country they were in at that time was in Côte d'Ivoire, Sodechi. Okay. England in the 80s, long ago, they had privatization of water sector. So if you're asking, where do I see the opportunities, right? I would think for private PPPs, biased because I'm a water, that's how I started this from water, right? So I think opportunities exist in water. Some people will say AI, right? Because AI is a big thing, right?
Some people see the two might even be in conflict with each other.
Because you need a lot of water for AI and vice versa. They can be in conflict, but yeah, they could be in conflict, but they could also be sort of there's a symbiotic relationship. In other words, they could be dependent on each other because water is a very, it's like oil sector too. Now they say water is the next big thing because water is scarce. It doesn't have substitutes, right? And it used to be considered a human right, but probably water on the ground. Then you think about water infrastructure. Then you have to convince consumers that, listen, the private sector is involved. You need to pay for water. Is there willingness, ability to pay for water? Let me put it this way. It's actually one of the most challenging areas for private sector to actually work in because of the issue, especially in Africa, in terms of convincing consumers, the average consumer, and not just Africa, Latin America, like Bolivia, if you remember, with the protests that took place.
Down
Cochabamba.
They sent it careening down the street over an attempt to privatize the waters.
That's right. Cochabamba published on that extensively, law review articles of that years ago, and also corruption risk in water sector. Even though it's the most challenging, it's also where the opportunities lie, I think, especially in the future when you think about it, because AI requires water. Water, everything, we're pushing AI and water sector, right? AI right now, and the fact that it's the next big thing in terms of futures markets, in terms of investments, right? Mm-hmm. The SEP, Standard and Poor, everybody's going in and purchasing stocks. I just came from Semaphore last week, and we had a lot of very engaging guests that talked about this question of AI. AI was so big at the event, even at the World Bank, but everybody needs water. Companies need water just to be able to operate and survive. So I see water as the big thing. I still see it, although, I started with water and I'm doing SME, but I know infrastructure aspects of water will become even more critical because that's key, and the question becomes, how will Africa deal with the issue of not having reliable energy and access to, clean water? In other words, not water in the river, because we have a lot of water all over the place. But the question is turning it into technology-based effluent standards or whatever we need to be able to bring water for domestic purpose and also for commercial purpose. How will Africa engage with the private sector to make sure that either they provide cross subsidies for private companies to be able to provide, affordable water services to poor consumers who can't afford to pay, because you need to have operation maintenance costs. You need to recoup in terms of cost recovery, the capital costs that you put in when you're a private industry. You see, all those issues factor in water. It's complicated, but it's very, very important. So I see that as the big thing, the next big thing.
One of my favorite films is The Big Short. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
No, The Big Short?
The Big Short. So The Big Short is, Quincy, anything? Okay, so it's a very good movie. So it's about...
I'm going to take note of that.
Yes, The Big Short, it's about the 2008 financial crisis, but it really breaks down, I think, sort of what went on in a very, very digestible way for the average person. And I remember going on a rabbit hole after watching this movie. Number one, finding out just how much of water, like you said, like oil, like corn, like other commodities, how much of it runs off of futures contracts and derivatives, what Warren Buffett literally calls financial tools of financial weapons of mass destruction. But also that Michael Burry, one of the early detectors of the 2008 crisis, one of the people who saw it coming first, now trades largely in water, in futures contracts. And with respect to, this is one of the reasons that I took a class on, at first I called them P3s. He said, he remarked on that. He said, it's P3s to us. Most of the world is PPP. And, but he remarked on how much it is necessary for firms, nations, different stakeholders to really dive head first into solving these issues, because they're not going to go away. Because the questions of water access, water infrastructure, the provision and the raising of living standards, if it is not addressed with respect to the private sector, you risk sort of an inertia that ends you up in a worse place, in a worse place overall, and you end up in a situation like in Bolivia, where again a bus gets lit on fire and sent downhill down the street because, it's a very serious issue done in a haphazard way or if done in a way that does not have, like you said, that social responsibility, in a central way moving throughout it.
The key is how do you incentivize corporations to be socially? I loved my class. I taught this for years at the Catholic University, the corporate social responsibility class. And you mentioned Warren Buffett. I really like his principle because it's about for profit maximization, but reconciling that with also utilitarian normative values. he applies both. It's very important to also think about both. I think corporations, Warren Buffett, also Merck, the drug company.
BRCK,
Yeah, remember, yeah, they German, they initially, I think they were incorporated in Germany. You know, they cured river blindness. They provided blindness drugs to African nations, and the public, you know, this ties in with the water question of social responsibility and the fact that sometimes there's a perception that if corporations become socially responsible and applying utilitarian normative values more than for profit maximization, like Friedman, you know, the Friedman model. Yes, but so the body shop, that what would happen is that they would lose, right? Because people are not thinking long term. Most scholars are not thinking, or practitioners in this field. But with Merck, what happened was that they derived indirect economic benefit from that charitable philanthropic act of provide. I'm not saying every company should do it, but Merck could afford. The founder was really good because of their mission at the time. And when they provided free drugs to cure river blindness in Africa at that time, there were those who were naysayers. Oh no, you're going to lose. But what happened was they derived indirect economic benefits. How do you think they did? How do you think they derived it? They derived it because they started attracting very good scientists after that. Good public image, positive image, and people, their customers and patients started telling their doctors, we want that drug. We want to purchase other drugs that Merck, manufactures because they're a very good company. So there's an indirect benefit to positive image because consumers have a lot of power, So likewise, I think companies can do a better job, and I think they are. Some water companies are doing pretty well, but I think government intervention, that's where the public sector comes in with either providing targeted subsidies, also looking at areas of money, what role do we play along that supply chain of water, supplying water services? Because, water is also energy, hydropower, There's agri. There's so many competing interests in water. Is incredible. It's an incredible sector, because it has spiritual value. The Ganges River, and in Africa is worship. People worship. So when private sector is dealing with water, and in terms of intervening in the sector, it becomes a very how do I put it, complicated sector for them, but it's worthwhile. Because there's no substitute. It's life. Everybody needs it. So we'll see where that goes.
As somebody who, like yourself, is very interested in geopolitics, is always, poking my head in other parts of the world to see what's going on, and then trying to see, sort of what happens next based on what we're seeing. I think that, it was already. Some people might say that the catalyst for even starting to look in this direction was the formation of the AES, and then also the war in Ukraine, in terms of the world becoming a bit more regional, countries looking sort of in their backyards. We talked about the AfCFTA. I want to make sure I get my acronym. The AfCFTA,
Africa Continental Future Area.
In terms of that regional cooperation, in terms of their, great power competition turning into sort of regional spheres of influence. How do you see the regional development of trade and these sort of infrastructure development projects, taking place in terms of that, in terms of that cooperation that is multinational, but is very not limited, but contained in who the participants are, who the stakeholders are.
Players.
Yes, well.
So the dynamics between the regional body and the geopolitical space, how the power play takes place.
I think
that framework.
I think you cut straight to the center of.
Well, it's a really good question because, people talk about the role of AFC. When AfCFTA came into being 2019 was when it actually came into effect, but it was operationalized because of COVID was operationalized 2021. I know my brother, His Excellency Wamkele, he's a good friend too, the Secretary General, and I'm very impressed. He's done a really good job of pushing things forward. Intra-Africa trade is 18% right now in terms of volumes, whereas trade between Africa and the rest of the world is actually much higher, some 50, some 60. So when you factor in the dynamics that's taking place within Africa of AfCFTA member nations and trading with each other, abiding by the rules of the game of AfCFTA, given the fact that 54 of the 55 member nations have signed, and it's in operation right now with those countries. Trading within Africa versus trading with outside Africa, with other countries. Article 18 of AfCFTA, the agreement, actually allows African countries to trade with other countries that are not member states of AfCFTA, so long as you don't give better treatment, preferential treatment to the non-member states. One. On the question of the power play, I would also include BRICS because there's so many bodies besides AfCFTA. There's AGOA, and AGOA is the bilateral. It's not a treaty. There's ECOWAS. There's different regional blocks. But the difference between the AfCFTA and the regional blocks, like you have ECOWAS, you have SADC, Southern Africa Development Corporation, that's Southern region. You have EAC, which is the Eastern part. And then the difference between all the little different regional bodies, like for Eastern Africa, for Southern, and then for East, the ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States, and the AfCFTA, is that AfCFTA is Africa-wide, for one thing. Now, so the way most scholars and practitioners view AfCFTA is that there are currently a few challenges, infrastructure challenges, in terms of it's easier for an African, say, Nigerian trader to travel from Nigeria to England than to travel from Nigeria to, say, South Africa, because you have to go through London. So the plane, they're working on it now in terms of air travel, airspace. They're also working on, people talk about China Belt and Road initiatives. There's fast trains, regional train, because you can't really move things forward as quickly if you don't have deal with the infrastructure challenges.
Especially transportation.
So, transportation, logistics, also water, access to water, reliable water service, because you need water for to manufacture your products. Value addition along supply chain, local manufacturing ability. We actually, His Excellency invited us, ACDI, and we moderated a panel in the health sector, AGOA forum in South Africa, 2020, about 2 years ago, 2023, December forum. We're hoping there'll be another AGOA forum under the new administration. So all those factors and all those challenges they're working on now to make sure they overcome those challenges. Now, I'm happy to say that the PAPS is in place. In other words, when you're talking about the dimension of global, the monetary system, the DFIs, we have the dollarized economy. So when Africa is trading when African countries are trading on a regional level, how does that work within the framework of devalued currency? In other words, dollar that's not strong. So what they've done too, and dollar that's also scarce for the average, and if you're trading in Ghana cedis or South African rand, Nigerian, whatever, if a trader is in Nigeria, they want to export to Ghana, or Sierra Leone, should they pay in dollars, or should they pay in the local currency? So the PAPS system has dealt with that issue. The Pan-African Payment System. That's what it's called, the PAPS. So you all that are there that are going to be watching, you know about the Pan-African Payment System. And this is one of the things we do. we expose and or we provide access to that intellectual capital to those traders so they know, hey, wait a minute, you know that you can actually send your money to the pay in your local currency through the banking system and avoid the SWIFT code. You know, SWIFT is in US, yes. So that's a very good thing that they've done, they put in place. Now you ask about, so that's one in terms of the dynamics of power play. So that's a de-dollarization process that's taking place within that geopolitical landscape or global landscape, so to speak. But I don't foresee that within the framework of BRICS, that the BRICS, that's another group, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus now there are additional countries. I think there are about 10 member states. The last time I checked, I think there are 10.
There are a couple of applications that are in limbo as well.
Yes, there are currently 10 members and 11 full members and 10 partners. Three AfCFTA member nations are also members of BRICS. South Africa was the first, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, 5. They were the first 5. And then they added other countries. The two of the additional countries that they added, I believe 6 countries joined as members. Nigeria is waiting in the wings. Uganda is also waiting. They're just partners. They're not members, of the African countries, Nigeria and the African countries that are members of BRICS that are also AfCFTA. 3 is South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia are members of BRICS and also AfCFTA. Is that an opportunity? Yes, it is. Because BRICS is very powerful in terms of GDP levels. AfCFTA, very powerful too. Close to $3 trillion, $2 trillion worth of, that's, planned. It's a planned in terms of what's the critical mass of, dollar trading is. That's what they're speculating because we're not there yet. They've defined the rules of origin for countries. Most countries now have non-zero, in terms of non-tariffs and low duties. But like I said, logistics, infrastructure challenges are getting in the way, but being, dealt with gradually and slowly. And I'm optimistic that that would materialize. Rome wasn't built in a day. It takes time, Yeah.
I'm glad that you provided the perfect segue to one of our sort of back end topics to the conversation in terms of the time, but and a sector that I always found very fascinating in grad school, especially when it came time to discuss economic policy sort of rules, and that is the informal sector. We both know that the informal sector plays a very, very large role in African economies in general. And we also know that the same is true throughout the developing world. And even, you can walk down the street, we're in Washington, D.C. right now. You can walk down the street, government of the most powerful city in the world, and you can see people who are actively working in the informal sector where, those things are, commerce and, commerce, goods, services, all sorts of commerce is going on outside the traditional financial system. So with this forming such a significant part of African economies, and with you being somebody who works, again, directly on the ground with people, but also in the institutional capacity, what role do you see the informal sector playing going forward, especially with respect to what you would like to see in the work that you do? And I ask this because, it's obviously not an either or sort of thing, but it's like, okay, well, on one hand, is it that you put in place, you sort of go with the flow of the river, so to speak, in putting into place different services and pieces of infrastructure that allow people to live more prosperous lives in the informal sector, thus enabling them to formalize in while they sort of increase their own prosperity? Or is it sort of is formalization sort of the main goal of things, right? It's facilitate the formalization and then sort of begin to take things up the value chain, as you said.
Yes.
Like I said,
Good question. Because, statistically, this is not me, but this is DFI's. SMEs hire 80% of the workforce in Africa. Just, yeah. Of that, about, I would say this statistics, 60% are really in the informal sector, 60% in the informal sector of that 80%. And then 98% of SMEs hire less than 10 employees. This is just all of Africa, the exceptions in different parts of Africa, right? And then 2% of SMEs hire more than 10. We talked about a little bit of that when we were discussing the definitions. And so informal sector is big. About 70% of trans-border trade currently within the framework of AfCFTA are women and youth, and most of them in the informal sector, the cross-border traders. And these are the ones that are very difficult to reach. And these are the ones that we try. When we hosted President Orama of Afrexim, Africa Export Import, he's no more the president. He's awesome. He's very good. He just, his term completed. We discussed these issues because outreach is very important. You mentioned what do they contribute to the African economy. They are the SMEs as a whole are the backbone, but the informal sector, they actually contribute in terms of when you're looking at GDP levels, when you're looking at flow of resources across border, right? They contribute to that. Sometimes it's difficult to capture because they don't pay taxes. They don't trust banks. I know. They don't. And do you expect them to trust banks when some of those women I've had conversations with when I travel to Africa? Because I'm always curious. I'm like, I wear the practitioner hat and I wear the professor hat and I'm a walking intellectual. So I go to what they call mama put, that they sell their, what do they call it, dodo on the streets. And they also have they have cultural aversion to being taxed. They have cultural aversion to being told to open a bank account because they don't trust the banks because of high interest rates. They are swimming we divide our clients. I didn't mention, but I should mention, into survivalist SMEs who barely don't pay us anything. We just do it for pro bono reasons. And the opportunist SMEs and those survivalists are mostly informal that we go out, and talk to and help out and whatever. And the opportunist ones. And so, yes, they do contribute, but I think it's a double-edged sword. Let me put it this way. The government in most African countries have banned street hawkers because of the aesthetic beauty problem and all that. But street hawkers still exist. What we call the mama puts, they on the streets, they sell their yam, plantain or whatever, or water. I had a conversation with some of them because I was looking at M&A. I worked as an M&A attorney too. I know you know that. And I'm like, when you talk about economies of scale and capitalizing on large economies of scale to be more productive, let me just explore this with these people on the streets. I went to one of them, or some of them. I just walked around in Victoria Island in Lagos. One was sent, and these are illegal. It's now illegal, but they look around. There's no police, and they're there. As soon as they hear there's the army or police, they just hide or whatever. Because this is they're living from hand to mouth. You have them inland, but you also have cross-border. But the issues they face are different. The cross-border ones. But we have time. I can discuss that. But like I said, they contribute in terms of flow of resources, but not enough to the government in terms of not paying taxes, right? But they do contribute in terms of feeding people, right? Because people buy their food. Some bankers, high-level people look left, right, nobody's looking because their food is great. That's right. So their issues of IP, should they be given, I'm not one, at some point in time, I thought, formalize. But like I told you, the issue of trust amongst themselves, because I was telling you earlier, I don't want, I don't want to miss that one. When I talked with them, one was selling yam, one was selling plantain, one was selling water. So I said, this is a restaurant. You can all merge. Oh no, I'm not going. That one will poison me. Superstition of no, I'm keeping, and they put their money in there. They don't want. We want me to merge. But you can all be one firm. You can be one restaurant, right? Plantain, and you make more money because you will not have a fragility issue. But they don't buy that. Also, do you want to get a bank account? No, we don't. They will eat our money. No, we don't want to do that. Madam, no way. We will not do that. So it's a hard nut to crack. But they're contributing in terms of providing services to customers on the ground. But some countries are now turning it, like we have halal trucks in the US. You have to offer them something. You can have halal trucks say, hey, you're really hot in this heat. You don't have a fan. Why don't we give you fringe benefits? You have a fan, you have this is what you're going to pay for. That's something we're working on with policymakers and implementers to convince them that there's a benefit to doing that and maybe offering them some targeted subsidies or, perks here and there where they could then be convinced at some point that they can go to banks and also reducing interest rate for them. 30%, 20%, that's a lot for an average female trader. Some of them are registered, and when they register, they don't see benefit to incorporate it because of the high cost. So convincing them but being able to provide those benefits is critical to the process. And even the cross-border ones, getting them aware in terms of intellectual capital, access to intellectual capital about the implications of, say, AfCFTA, because some of the customs people on the borders when they don't know that they're not supposed to pay duties, like crossing from, say, one country to another, they bribe them. They're told to bribe the customs officers. Sometimes they are told to prostitute themselves in return to cross. Oh, you have a bag of rice. Okay, why don't you pay to cross? You're supposed to pay money. And if they don't know what the implications of AfCFTA are for them, for their country and the others, meaning you don't have to pay duties to cross, then they'll think they're supposed to be paying money. So those are the kind of issues that we deal with. Information is always power.
And information asymmetry.
Economic empowerment. Yeah.
And information asymmetries is kind of where I want to finish this out on. I would really like to ask you a little bit more about the youth aspect of things. We know Africa is very, very young continent. I believe, I forget what the statistic is, but a very large section, a very large plurality of the continent is below the age of 18, especially large cohorts under the age of 35. So when we think about this capacity building, we think about service provision to formalize or to not formalize, and sort of expanding opportunities for these for these small and medium-sized enterprises, and also thinking about the future of not just regional blocks but transnational and transcontinental sort of trade flows. What do you see? Where will Afrocosmo, where is and where will Afrocosmo sort of, or how will they tailor their services towards this very youthful cohort? What do you think is most important in terms of what capacities do you believe are most important in building in that age cohort?
The youth, because we actually work with them, the youth, ACDI, the female and youth. That's why we include youth in that, and youth for us is, and I think 18 to 35. Sometimes it goes a little above. This is a very important question, because I think access to finance, more money in their pocket through I give you the example of the farmer that we helped, but the sector that I'm very keen on is science innovators. And that's where we are looking right now. Science innovators and inventors. My goodness. there are a lot of youth, economically disadvantaged youth in Africa and the diaspora space that are inventors, geniuses. We're actually going to be having, we'll let you all know when it happens. I think Mike will be involved in this too. We're planning an event, a forum on access to investment and financial capital for that demographic group. And in fact, not just youth, but also children, because there's some children that, you remember the boy who harnessed the wind, William? There's a movie based on him. He's from Malawi. And I see you're shaking. Yeah, you know about him. You're the audience, and you know, Mike, don't tell me you don't know about William. A genius, yes. He's one of quite a number of them he's now older. He's now in his 40s. And he invented a windmill in his village. And he wasn't even, the youth. Youth is 18 to 35, but these are below youth. So we're actually not only looking at youth, but we're looking at children too. And in villages, in rural parts, in urban slums, wherever you are, that's what I'm telling you. There's a gap there in terms of access to investment and financial capital. And we provide the avenue for them to have that through forums, almost like a Shark Tank-like is what we want to do. We've started the process. It's so important because when they have that ability, it should not be wasted. You know what I mean? And there are many out there. Yeah.
I think that is what I will title today's episode. Ability should not be wasted.
That's right.
Dr. Val Okaru-Bisant, we want to thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you so much for your time and your insights here on the Money and Breakfast podcast this evening.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.